She was 30 years old when the circuit judge signed a paper that ended her marriage and, with a stroke of the same pen, ended the only life she had known. Her name was Sarah Kessler, and in the spring of 1898, in a wheat country town called Altamont, Kansas, her husband Nathaniel had gone before the same judge 2 weeks earlier to declare the marriage a failure of her making, though it was his own gambling debts and his own wandering eye that had emptied their household of everything worth keeping. When it was finished, Sarah walked out of the courthouse with $31 she had managed to hide away in a coffee tin over 3 careful years, a trunk of clothes, and a reputation the town had already decided, without asking her a single question, to pity rather than respect. She heard, within days, that a windmill on an abandoned quarter section northwest of town, its blades broken, its tower leaning, the well beneath it long since given up for dry, was being sold by the county for almost nothing. Since no farmer wanted land everyone said had gone bad. Sarah bought it anyway, for $4, with a foolishness the whole town would talk about for weeks. What no one knew, not even Sarah herself as she signed her name to the deed, was that sealed inside that broken windmill's ruined workings lay a secret that would not only give her back a life of her own, but would return to Altamont something it had lost and quietly grieved for 11 years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Sarah Kessler. If you have ever had to build a new life out of almost nothing, tell us in comments. We'd love to hear how you did it. Sarah had not been raised for scandal or ruin. She had grown up the eldest daughter of Henrik and Ruth Larson, Swedish immigrants who had broken sod on a homestead 8 miles east of Altamont back when the whole county was still more grass than furrow, and from her father she had learned a trade most women of her generation never touched, the mechanics of windmills. Henrik Larson had not been a wealthy man, but he had been a gifted one, possessed an almost instinctive understanding of gears and gudgeons, of how a fantail caught the wind and turned a wheel, of how a sucker rod carried that turning motion down a well shaft to lift water where the prairie itself offered none. He had built and repaired windmills for half the farms in the county. And because he had no son, and because Sarah trailed after him from the time she could walk, asking questions no one thought to answer for a girl, he taught her everything he knew without ever once suggesting it was unusual to do so. By 12, she could climb a windmill tower with a wrench in her belt and diagnose a stuck governor by ear alone, listening to particular clatter of mechanism in distress the way another child might listen for a mother's voice in a crowded room. Ruth Larson, for her part, taught her daughter something quieter but no less essential: how to keep accounts, how to barter fairly, how to hold her head up a room full of people who thought a woman's place was elsewhere, because Ruth herself had run the family's modest dealings with a grain co-op with shrewdness the men of Altamont grudgingly respected even as they resented it. It was Henrik who used to tell her, standing beneath some farmer's broken mill, with the wind combing the grass around them, that a windmill was the most honest machine ever built, because it could not lie about what ailed it. Every rattle, every groan, every misturn of the wheel told you exactly where the trouble lived, if only you were patient enough to listen. He told her this so often, in so many different broken-down yards across the county, that it became less a lesson about machinery, and more ways Sarah came to understand the world itself. That trouble always left a trace, that patience was a kind of intelligence, and that the things everyone else had given up on often still had good work left in them, if someone cared enough to climb up and listen. Henrik Larson died when Sarah was 19, thrown from a wagon on an icy road, and Ruth followed him into the ground less than 2 years later, worn down by grief and a hard winter that took half her strength before the fever took the rest. Sarah was 21, alone on a homestead too small to farm profitably by herself, when Nathaniel Kessler came calling, a handsome, quick-talking young man newly arrived in Altamont with ambitions of building a mercantile business, full of charm and easy promises, and Sarah, lonely and practical in equal measure, believed she saw in him a partner who would let her keep something of her father's legacy while building a life of her own. She sold the homestead to help finance Nathaniel's store, kept her father's tools in a trunk out of some sentiment she could never quite explain even to herself, and settled into what she believed, for first several years, was a reasonably contented marriage. It was only slowly, the way rot spreads through a beam no one thinks to inspect, that she came to understand Nathaniel's charm concealed a man who could not hold on to money, who gambled away the mercantile's profits in back rooms 2 counties over, and who grew colder toward her with every year that passed without the children she had once hoped for, and he, it turned out, had never truly wanted. By the time the marriage collapsed in the spring of 1898, the mercantile itself had failed 18 months prior, sold off to satisfy Nathaniel's debts, and the modest house they had shared went with it soon after, claimed by the same creditors. Nathaniel left Aldermont within a week of the divorce, taking what little remained and a young woman from the next county, whose father, people whispered, had money Nathaniel had already begun courting before the ink on the divorce papers dried. Sarah was left with her coffee tin of $31, her trunk of clothes, and, because she had refused to let it go even when Nathaniel mocked her for the sentiment, her father's old tool chest, its leather straps cracked, but its contents, wrenches and gauges and the specialized tools of a windmill trade, still sound. Aldermont did not turn cruel toward Sarah all at once, but it turned distant, the way towns do toward a woman whose misfortune makes people uncomfortable in ways they cannot quite name. The women who had once invited her to quilting circles found their circles somehow always already full. The bank, run by a narrow, ambitious man named Cyrus Deal, who had been the chief creditor in the mercantile's collapse and had profited handsomely from Nathaniel's ruin, made a point of telling anyone who asked that he doubted Mrs. Kessler. She kept the name out of stubbornness more than affection, had the sense God gave a goose, given how she let her husband run their business into the ground, a judgment as unfair as it was widely repeated. Sarah took in mending and washing to keep herself fed through that first hard month, staying in a rented room above the harness shop, and it was there, in early June, that she heard two farmers discussing the county's plan to auction off an abandoned quarter-section northwest of town, land that had passed through 3 failed owners in as many years and was rumored, unfairly, to be cursed with a well that had gone permanently dry. The land itself Sarah had no interest in. She had neither the capital nor, after the mercantile's failure, the appetite to farm. But when the auctioneer mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the windmill standing on the property would be sold separately from the land itself, since the county saw no value in a tower with broken blades and a leaning frame, something in Sarah lifted its head for the first time since the divorce. She remembered her father's hands guiding hers along a fantail's edge. She remembered the particular satisfaction of a well going from dry to gushing under skilled repair. And she remembered, with a clarity that surprised her, that broken things were not always what they appeared to be from the ground. When the bidding opened at $5 and drew no takers, the whole town having already decided the mill and the land beneath it were bad luck, Sarah offered for, was met with laughter from the small crowd gathered near the courthouse steps, and was awarded the windmill anyway, since the county one had gone from their books more than they wanted a higher price. She rode out to the quarter section the following morning in a borrowed wagon, her father's tool chest rattling in the bed behind her, and found the windmill exactly as described and somehow worse. Its tower canted a full 10 degrees off true. 2 of its 4 blades snapped clean off and lying in the tall grass below, the platform at its base rotted through in places, and the whole structure wearing the particular gray, weathered look of a thing that had stood neglected through many winters. But Sarah, climbing the tower's ladder with the same unhesitating confidence her father had taught her, found something in the housing at the top that made her pause with her hand still on the rung. The mechanism inside, though rusted and seized, was not the ordinary works of a common farm windmill. It was finer, more elaborate, fitted with brass components she recognized from her father's own descriptions of specialty mills built for a particular purpose, not for irrigation or stock water, but for milling grain, a windmill built to grind rather than merely to pump, and wedged into a gap behind the seized gearing, protected from decades of weather by the housing itself. She found a small oilcloth packet, tied with twine gone brittle but intact, tucked so deliberately into that hidden space that it could not have arrived there by accident. Sarah did not open the packet that first day, occupied instead with the more urgent business of assessing just how much labor the tower itself would demand before it collapsed entirely under its own lean. But she carried it home to her rented room above the harness shop and set it on a small table beside her bed, and that night, by lamplight, she untied the brittle twine with the same careful patience her mother had taught her over ledger books years before. Inside she found not money, not jewels, but papers, a set of surveyed documents, a hand-drawn map of the quarter section marked with symbols she did not immediately understand, and a short letter, water-stained but legible, signed by a name that meant nothing to her that first night, but would, within a week, mean a great deal to the entire town of Aldermont. The letter was signed by a man named Josiah Trent, and it was dated 11 years earlier, in the spring of 1887. Sarah read it twice through before its full meaning settled over her, and when it did, she sat for a long while in the lamplight with her father's tool chest at her feet, feeling the particular vertigo of a woman who has stumbled, quite by accident, into a story far larger than her own troubles. Josiah Trent. The letter explained in a hand grown increasingly urgent toward its final lines, had been the engineer and chief investor behind Aldermont's original grain cooperative mill, a project the town's founding families had celebrated as the future of prosperity, a proper milling operation that would let local farmers process their own wheat into flour, rather than shipping raw grain at a loss to mills 2 counties away. Trent had sunk his own considerable fortune into the venture, had personally designed the specialty windmill on the quarter section as a working prototype and testing ground for the larger cooperative mill he intended to build in town itself, and had, in the spring of 1887, uncovered evidence that the co-op's board, chief among them a younger, more ambitious version of the same Cyrus Deal who now ran Aldermont's bank, had been quietly diverting investor funds meant for the mill's construction into land speculation schemes that ultimately failed, leaving the cooperative bankrupt before a single stone of the town mill was laid. Trent had confronted Deal and the other board members privately. The letter explained, hoping to recover what funds remained and salvage at least a working prototype on the quarter section, but had been met instead with threats disguised as reasonable business counsel, quiet suggestions that a man who made too much noise about missing investor money might find himself facing fraud charges of his own, since Trent's own signature appeared on documents authorizing certain of the very transactions he now questioned, documents he had signed in good faith without reading closely enough, trusting men he should not have trusted, ruined, discredited before he could properly defend himself, and facing genuine legal jeopardy manufactured by men with far more standing in the town than he possessed. Trent had fled Aldermont within the month, but not before hiding, inside the one piece of his work the co-op's collapse had left untouched, a full accounting of what had truly happened. The surveyed documents proving the land speculation scheme, the map marking parcels Deal and his fellow board members had secretly acquired with the diverted funds, and his letter laying out, plainly and for any future reader, exactly how an honest venture had been turned to private profit at the whole town's expense. Sarah understood, reading this by lamplight in a rented room she could barely afford, that she was holding proof of a fraud that had crippled Aldermont's prosperity for over a decade, for the town had indeed struggled in the years since, its farmers still shipping raw wheat at a loss, its promised cooperative mill never built, its younger generation drifting away to towns with better opportunity, while Cyrus Deal had grown steadily wealthier, his bank prospering in ways that, seen now through the lens of Trent's letter, looked considerably less innocent than they once had. She understood, too, with a clarity that felt almost like her father's voice returning to her, that the windmill itself, this ruined, mocked, cursed piece of machinery she had bought for $4 out of some half-articulated instinct, was not simply a broken thing to be repaired. It was evidence. It was a promise, made 11 years before by a ruined man to a town he still, in his final desperate act, hoped to protect. She spent the following days moving carefully, aware that whatever she did next would draw attention. She could not afford to draw carelessly. She sought out old Mr. Ambrose Whitfield, the town's retired notary and one of the few men in Aldermont who had served on the original cooperative's oversight committee before its collapse, a gentle, half-forgotten man now living quietly with his daughter's family, largely ignored by the town's current leading citizens. Whitfield, reading Trent's letter and studying the survey map with hands that shook slightly from age, confirmed what Sarah already suspected. He remembered Josiah Trent as an honest man wrongly disgraced, remembered the sudden, unexplained wealth that had allowed several board members to weather the co-op's collapse without apparent hardship, and remembered, most importantly, that he had signed as notary on several land transfers in that same year, whose true purpose he had never fully understood until this moment. Together, Sarah and the old notary began quietly comparing the parcels marked on Trent's map against the county land records, and found, entry after entry, that the very land Deal and his associates now held, including, Sarah realized with jolt, the quarter section on which her own windmill stood, purchased by the county after its previous owner defaulted, and now, through her own $4 bid, indirectly hers to investigate. traced back precisely to the diverted cooperative funds trends. Letter described. Word of Sarah's inquiries reached Cyrus Deal faster than she had hoped, Aldermont being the kind of town where a notary's granddaughter mentioning something at supper could reach the bank within a day. Deal came to her rented room above the harness shop himself, a courtesy she recognized immediately as calculated rather than kind, and suggested, in the smooth, reasonable tone she remembered from years of watching him do business with her former husband, that a woman recently divorced and evidently struggling might do well to focus her energies on more practical matters than old rumors about a failed venture 11 years past. He offered, when persuasion alone did not move her, to buy the Windmill in the quarter section outright for $50, a sum meant to sound generous and calculated. Sarah understood clearly to remove both the machine and whatever it had revealed from circulation entirely. When she declined, his tone cooled considerably, and he reminded her, with a particular menace of a man accustomed to being obeyed, that the bank held considerable influence over who in Aldermont could secure credit, rent rooms, or find respectable work. An influence, he implied without quite saying so, that could prove either helpful or hostile to a woman in her position. Sarah did not frighten easily, not after surviving a marriage's slow collapse and a town's cold shoulder, and Deal's threat, rather than silencing her, confirmed everything Trent's letter had already told her about the character of the man she was dealing with. She and Mr. Whitfield brought their findings before Judge Perkins Hollis, the same circuit judge who had presided over her divorce weeks before, a man Sarah approached with considerable trepidation, but who proved, to her relief, to possess a stronger sense of justice than her recent experience of the law had led her to expect. Hollis, reviewing the surveyed documents, the map, Trent's letter, and Whitfield's corroborating memory of the original transfers, agreed that the evidence warranted formal investigation and ordered the county land office to produce full records of the parcels in question, records that, once compared against Trent's 11-year-old map, left little room for innocent explanation. Deal cornered, attempted first to discredit Trent's letter as the ravings of a disgraced fraudster seeking revenge, and when that failed to gain traction against Whitfield's corroborating testimony, attempted next to claim the statute of limitations protected him from any consequence regardless of guilt, a claim Judge Hollis noted, with dry precision, might protect him from criminal prosecution, but did nothing to protect the considerable civil claim the cooperative's original investors, or their heirs, might now bring against land Deal held under demonstrably fraudulent circumstances. What followed was not the dramatic public ruin Sarah might once have wished on a man who had profited from her own husband's failures as readily as from Trent's, but something quieter and, in the end, more useful to the town that had suffered longest under the fraud's consequences. Facing the near certainty of a ruinous civil suit and the total collapse of the trust's banking business depended upon, Cyrus Deal agreed, through his lawyers, to a settlement that returned the fraudulently acquired parcels, including the quarter section and its windmill, to a newly reconstituted cooperative trust, and further agreed to fund, from his own considerable fortune, the construction of the grain mill Aldermont had been promised 11 years before and never received. Sarah, whose $4 purchase and patient investigation had uncovered the fraud, was named by unanimous vote of the reconstituted cooperative's board as chief engineer of the new mill's construction, a position that placed her father's long-in-use trade and her own inherited gift for understanding what broken things still had to offer at the very center of the town's rebuilding. Deal himself remained in Aldermont, his bank technically solvent, but he lived out his remaining years there as a man whose name, once spoken with the automatic respect wealth commands, was thereafter spoken with particular, permanent wariness a town reserves for someone who has learned, through hard experience, not fully to trust. And so it was that Sarah Kessler, divorced at 30 and left with little more than a coffee tin of savings and her father's old tools, found in a ruined windmill bought for almost nothing, not merely a curiosity to satisfy her own idle mechanical instincts, but the buried truth of a decade-old wrong and the means at last to set it right. She had climbed that leaning tower expecting nothing more than the small satisfaction of coaxing a broken machine back to life, and had found instead a promise made by a desperate, honest man 11 years before she ever swung her leg over that first rung, a promise that had waited, patient as her father always said good machinery could be patient, for someone willing to climb up and listen closely enough to hear what it had to say. The windmill still stands today on that quarter section northwest of Aldermont, restored now to sound working order, No longer a curiosity or a curse, but a quiet monument in this telling, to a truth Sarah Kessler had known since she was a girl at her father's side, that the things the town has given up on and the people has given up on alongside them are not always as broken as they appear from the ground. And sometimes it takes nothing more than $4 and a willingness to climb to prove it. Thank you for spending this time with Sarah's story and with us. If her journey moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share with someone who needs a reminder that a fresh start can come from the most unlikely places. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us about a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off. Until next time, stay close.